I never talked to them about sagging, ever. Because I couldn't see a correlation between how high or low your pants was and your intellectual aptitude. Right? Also, I know that some people live in environments, and this is one thing you got to understand about our young people. I got surveyed by this company one time, was trying to get me to give them some advice on young urban people, whatever. And they were like, what is it about young urban people that we need to understand? I said, we have to understand that everybody wants to be unique and the same at the same time. He said, what did you mean by that? I said, everybody want to have on Jordans, but they don't want to have on the same pair of Jordans. Everybody want to have on some J's, but they want to have their own unique twist on it. And I know in some communities, especially where I grew up at, telling a young guy to pull up his pants was making him stand out. And when you stand out, you're a victim of bullying, you're a victim of harassment. And nobody wants to be bullied and harassed because you stand out. There's some people who are courageous who will stand out. You always had those people in your community, the person who would dress totally different than everybody, right? And that's fine. But the vast majority of people do not want to stand out. So I don't have a conversation about aesthetic right off the bat. I just keep putting them in settings where their particular aesthetic is either going to stand out to a point to where they're like, I shouldn't dress like this when I'm in this space, or I'm just going to go ahead and evolve how I dress. That's kind of how I did it. So that's one thing, the judgment. The second thing that we're missing in dealing with our young people is being able to connect all of these moralistic, highbrow, this is what you should do kind of lessons with something actual material and practical. I worked, and I have worked for a long time in the African-centered school movement. And that movement was born out of a movement in the 60s that took place basically in Brooklyn. My man Jamar actually in Bed-Stuy. There's something called the East. Were you familiar with the East? Your family ever talk about the East? Yeah. And it was a movement led by a brother named G2 Weusi. And G2 Weusi started with what was called the first African-centered school, Watoto Shule. And then you start to see this emergence of schools in Chicago, Detroit, out here in Pasadena. One of the largest African-centered schools was here, all the way through Texas. All over the country we had these schools. And then they became under an umbrella of something called the Council of Independent Black Institutions, or CIBI. And this Council of Independent Black Institutions kind of organized all of these people. And what happens is through the mid-70s, all the way through really the end of the 80s was like the height. You had all of these young children coming out of these schools. Some of them, most of them was vast majority were just community people who wanted their children to have a high-level private school education. And some of them were actually people who were families who were organizers, right? And so what happened was we infused in these, and I taught 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade in one of these schools before. We infused this African-centered ethic, ethos, and information in these young people from K through 12. For those who had K through 12, I worked at the K through 12 institution. Most of them either went K through middle school or something like that. Eventually you had to go to the public school. But I worked in the K through 12 institution. And we grounded them in this, where they knew Malcolm and Fannie Lou and Ella Baker and Imhotep and Malcolm and Marcus Garvey and Martin Luther King and Howard Thurman and Queen Nzinga and Yaa Asantewaa and Jaramogi Abebe. And they knew all this stuff. They could identify Africa, all 53 countries, and know them by heart, alphabetical, and even on the map. And we did this stuff, but we couldn't employ them. Once we got through with them, we said, well, go get a job. Because the only thing we could really do, because most of us were volunteers or working at a very meager salary, is say, if you came back and worked for us, you're really not going to have no bread. So you got this cultural identity solid, but it's divorced from the actual ability to generate revenue. And I say that to say this. Communities are not legitimized by the moral standard bearers in their midst. Communities are legitimized by enterprises that employ and invest back into the communities. One of my teachers' name is James Small. And James Small says, we live in neighborhoods, not communities. Because if we lived in communities, we would own a vast majority of not only the retail and service spaces, but also the residential spaces. But we typically just occupy space in places that other people own. And so what we have to do is, along with all of these other kinds of connections, because when I worked at Arizona State University, that's a Pac-12 D1 institution. One of my good buddies is over academic success for the athletes there. And he assembled a bunch of brothers who are executives and do well in their particular field to talk to some of the athletes who they felt were not going to go to the league, but wanted to give them an idea of what they could be prepared for. And at the conclusion of this long kind of summit, the young men said, "We're really not trying to hear y'all because y'all not successful." And the guy was like, "I make $177,000 a year." Another guy was like, "I make $350,000. He said, "That's not successful to me." Because their perception of what being success, being a Division I Pac-10 athlete, making it to the league and being a multi-millionaire, right? Because their juniors, a guy who was playing with them a year ago, is now making $5 million. And they was like, if you make anything less than $5 million, you're not successful. But that speaks to something about being able to connect all of these moral, political, cultural things to something that's substantive and material. And those kinds of conversations and those kind of enterprises are going to have to be born out of this work. Is how do we resource and back up these things. These other communities that are thriving are not thriving because they go around with some kind of high moral standing. We can see that through all of the different cases we keep seeing in scandals. They're able to maintain their communities because they're able to say, we're going to not only send you to law school, you're going to come work in our law firm. And that provides a certain kind of culture. People say, well, you know, especially if you go to New York or something, and you see people dressed in their religious or cultural outfits, you're like, why would you walk around all day with that particular hat on, or growing that particular kind of beard, or wear that? Because I can make a living with this. I can live my life lived as this. You know, and you see that with a lot of Nation of Islam. Like Nation of Islam, like in the 90s, you see the Final Call newspaper, and it'd be like, Tony Williams, you know, is a writer. And then it'd be like, Janice Gabriel is a writer. And then 2 years later, it'd be Tony Muhammad and Janice Muhammad. Well, what was that? It's not just because they converted to Islam. They said, I can actually eat, live, and feed my family off of this stuff. So it's easy for me to be a Muslim because I can feed my family. I'm getting paid by the Final Call newspaper to live out my culture.
But can I ask you?
Yes, sir.
You see, the ironic part is what you kind of describes the duality of that I feel is the problem with mentoring.
Break it down.
Okay, first of all, mentoring always, in my mind, is always too short. It's not a lifetime event. It happens over a few weeks or a few months, as opposed to getting somebody from where they start to a good, productive life. Now, the duality is what you just described to me, where on one hand we say, hey, come as you want, SAG, hats, the whole thing, and then realize that we've got to find a way to mentor them into what they call the professional world. And the professional world, we're not maintaining these same businesses and jobs. We're not doing, I mean, Perry's joint is the coelacanth, it's the uniqueness in the black community. I wish we had more, but the fact is, the professional world won't take sagging pants and the whole thing. It just won't happen. So, I guess my big rub is, how do we get past the duality of saying, come as you are, but be prepared for a world that's much larger than you? You know, you see?
Yeah, two things. So, appreciate your comments too, brother. First thing is, yes, it's the mentoring relationship typically is truncated, right? But I know these guys, their whole adult life and will know them forever, right?
Sure. But
so,
you understand how unique they are.
Yeah, exactly. But no, how many of y'all is it?
I'm gonna tell you right now.
It's about 70, 80 of y'all, right? Yeah.
It's about all of us that was raised with him still stay in contact.
Yeah, it's about 70, 80. I got
But
about
here's the thing, we got 19 million educated black men in America. 19 million.
Yeah.
And half of them are having a hard time finding a job.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about this. So, but what I'm saying is that it can be what you described, but it doesn't have to be, right? But it depends on the nature of the relationship. So that's one thing. But typically they are, because they are not organic. Most of my relationships with people I mentor are organic. They're authentic. We weren't sitting in a room and said, you gonna sit with him, right? It's just they self-selected and we made those kind of connections. That's one thing. So that is a challenge. We have to figure out how do we make these programs more in-depth and more protracted. your statement of phrasing and saying preparation for the professional world is making an assumption. It's making an assumption that the role of a mentor is strictly I've been here, I've done it, this is how it's done, this is how you need to do it if you're going to do X. In a mentorship relationship, in Optimum in me, it's really about me engaging that person on their journey. And as they're engaged on their journey, they'll raise up something and I put a critical lens on it. So I rarely do any direct. 3 years ago, said, I need to talk to you. I said, man, what you want to talk about? I'll talk to you about my job. So he calls me and spills his guts about how he feels about his job. And I never tell him what to do or what not to do, right, Jess? We just talk about scenarios. And we talked about 5 different scenarios that he made certain kind of decisions. And at that point, Jess was able to make whatever decision he needed to make. So I don't necessarily